In this lecture, we'll be exploring the Abbasid Empire. In the Middle Ages, the Middle East was the world center for scholarship, culture, and science as Europe had barely emerged from the Dark Ages. And when people talk about this golden age, they're typically talking about the Abbasid Caliphate or the Abbasid Empire. So after we go through this lesson, you'll understand how scientific golden ages come about and why one such period occurred in the Middle East while Europe was still recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. There's a quote, "The ink of the scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr." So goes this hadith, a saying of Islam ascribed to Muhammad, which I think is a good description for the Abbasid period, which lasted from 750 to 1258. The 9th and 10th centuries especially are considered by many historians to be the cultural and scientific golden age of Islam. There were a lot of scientific revolutions that took place here. Also, significant scholarship in medicine, mathematics, alchemy, which was the forerunner of chemistry, that came to influence Europe when there was more interaction between Europe and the Middle East following the Crusades in the 12th and 13th century, and what many historians consider to be the beginning of the Renaissance. Okay, so the beginning of this period. From 661 to 750, the leaders of the Islamic world were the Umayyad Caliphate, as we talked about in the last lesson. They were the winners in the first civil war in Islam and centered in Syria. However, many Muslims resented that the Umayyad family had shown favoritism to its own clans and didn't fairly distribute the spoils of war. They culturally marginalized people from Mecca and Medina and other places from the Arabian province. And beyond that, they weren't even descendants from Muhammad's family or have a familial connection to him, as did many of the earlier caliphs. The Abbasid family, which claimed direct descent from Muhammad and therefore had a stronger basis of legitimacy, they appealed to these groups. Let me go ahead here in the notes. The Abbasid family appealed to groups marginalized by the Umayyads and overthrew them in 750. From this moment, they began a 500-year reign and established the capital of Baghdad as the global center of learning and scholarship. And there's the map earlier that we saw of the extents of the Abbasid Caliphate. Okay, so some of the facts of the Abbasid Revolution and how it came about, how they managed to dislodge the Umayyads, and why this was important. As I said earlier, the Abbasids claimed that they inherited the mantle of spiritual leadership from Ibn al-Hanafiya and his son Abu Hashim, who passed on the mantle to Muhammad ibn Ali, the great-grandson of Abbas. At this time period, as we talked about before, not everybody supported the Umayyad Caliphate. There was a lot of dissension in this period, and many people who thought that they didn't properly deserve to take on the mantle of Islam and represent the Muslim world. This represented opportunities for an upstart or anyone who could rally enough opposition against them to dislodge them, which is what we see happens with the Abbasid Revolution. They managed to appeal to people on the fringes of the Umayyad Empire, particularly in Iraq and Khorasan, and especially new converts to Islam who didn't have as strong tribal ties or as good patronage connections to the Umayyads. Where this really comes about is in 743, when Muhammad ibn Ali dies and is replaced by his son Abu Muslim. And then there are a series of battles that take place that lead up to the eventual victory of the Abbasids. In 747, Abu Muslim's Khorasani forces march against the Umayyads. In 749, Abu Muslim's brother, Abu al-Abbas, is named caliph, and he takes Damascus from the Umayyads. The last Umayyad prince was Abd al-Rahman. However, the Muslim political authority in Spain continues to call itself the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba. So sometimes on maps you'll see the Umayyad Caliphate that goes on well after this period ends, and they consider themselves the daughter state of the Umayyad Empire, but it's not connected to the old traditional Umayyad Empire in the same way. The Umayyad Caliphate essentially dies once the Abbasids take over. So here are some aspects of the Abbasid Empire and why it led to so much scientific revival. There were events that took place in fights between Sunnis and Shias. There was a Sunni inquisition called the Minna during the reign of Al-Mamun, which is interesting because Al-Mamun, if there's anyone who's celebrated as a leader who promotes scientific revolution, it would be him. It's probably during his reign that scientific advancement really takes its strongest steps. And keep in mind, this is in 800 AD. In Europe at the time, this is approximately during the reign of Charlemagne. But most educational institutions have largely collapsed at this time. It's not until a few centuries later, during the medieval Renaissance in Europe, that educational institutions are rebuilt and you start to see mathematical, philosophical, and scientific progress happening again. However, there's a lot of big things happening in Al-Mamun's time. Just to give you one example, he consulted with geographers and cartographers and developed a world map at this time. There's a large recreation of this at the Islamic Science Museum in Istanbul, Turkey, and it's quite accurate. Obviously, the New World isn't included because it wasn't discovered until 6 centuries later, but there's a fairly accurate depiction of Asia, much of Europe, the northern coast of Africa going to the Sahara, and it depicts the Indian Ocean as an ocean and not as an enclosed lake, which is an important correction to classic antiquity and its depiction of the world. There's also a lot of more formal government structures that are developed at this time. The Abbasids developed elaborate bureaucracies, divan, positions like the Divan al-Barid. There are also scribes, the Khatib, and chief of ministry, the Wazir, known as Vezir in other languages. So you see more sources that we find at this time. We have a much better understanding historically of what's happening in the Abbasid period than we do in earlier periods in Islam. And also a lot of the important early chroniclers and historians of Islam are writing at this period. So outside of the Quran itself and quotes attributed to Muhammad, the earliest histories we have about Islam largely come from this period. This is a problem for historians because some argue that these histories aren't accurate histories of Muhammad's life in the 6th and 7th century, but they're 8th or 9th century projections back into the past. So this is something that historians argue about a lot, about how good these sources are. We also see a more formalized class of religious scholars, the ulama, appear. And because there's a more formalized class of scholars, we also see a hammering out of Sunni orthodoxy. Sunni is from the word sunnah, the path and customs of Muhammad. So the structures of what makes Sunniism Sunni and Shiaism, beyond political differences and questions of succession of the caliphate, really start to appear at this time. Baghdad, is of course very important. It became the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and it sat at the crossroads of Eurasia and regained its status as a world center for philosophy, science, and medicine. This was a position it held during the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, but now it regained it 2,000 years later. Many texts from the ancient world were assembled and translated into Arabic at the House of Wisdom, which was the world's first scientific venture. If it weren't for this venture, then texts written in ancient Greek and other languages most likely would have been lost. There's a lot of translation occurring here, not just from Greek into Arabic, but Syriac is a major language since it was still a major language amongst Christians who were important administrators and scholars within the Abbasid Caliphate. Philosophy and science were discovered, rediscovered, and promulgated during this time, and this includes Aristotelian philosophy, geometry, algebra, which is an Arabic word in origin, Almost all words that start with al are Arabic in origin, due to the definite article al in Arabic, al. So algebra, alchemy, even alcohol. And the algorithm, which is also an Arabic word. Early forms of the scientific method were developed and eventually spread to Europe, an event that many scholars believe planted the seeds of the Renaissance. The Abbasids also had a long-lasting influence on the Islamic world, as they were the first to develop elaborate bureaucracies. So within this framework, classes of religious scholars, known as the ulama, coalesced and hammered out Sunni orthodoxy. And here, off to the right side of the screen, you can see an early Arabic work on algebra. This is an example of the scientific works that are happening. Ibn al-Haytham, considered the father of the scientific method by many. But then there's a waning of power that takes place. The Abbasids' power starts to wane as other Muslim groups challenge their authority. Such groups include the Ghaznavids. This is a dynasty founded by former soldier slaves that extended all the way to India. Another group that challenged them were the Seljuks, a Turkish and Persian Sunni Muslim dynasty that ruled much of the Middle East and Central Asia from the 11th to 14th centuries. So when we say that the Abbasid Caliphate continued from 750 to 1258, that does not mean that they controlled the whole Muslim world. Not at all. I mean, the idea of a unified state that's as unified as a modern nation state, first of all, never existed because it was politically impossible. But other Muslim nations are already starting to form. Maybe they would have acknowledged with their mouths the legitimacy of the Abbasid Caliphate as inheriting the spiritual authority of the early caliphs, but they still ran a perfectly independent state. The final death blow to the Abbasid Caliphate was brought about by a group that no one expected, however. And what's interesting is this group wasn't a rival Middle Eastern Muslim state or the Christian Byzantine Empire to the north. Instead, it was an ethnic group on the outsides and outskirts of Muslim and Chinese civilization that was at best ignored by other empires, but mostly seen as a troublesome nuisance for its raids and attacks on villagers. This group rose to power in the 13th century and was led by a dynamic warrior that plundered Asia and re-altered the world map. His name was Genghis Khan. He led the Mongol horde, and we're going to pay a lot of attention to him in other lessons because he's had major impact on the Muslim world. And I just want to do a brief overview of those other nations and then also mention Islamic law very briefly before we go into the next thing. This is a map of the Middle East in 970. So you see the Buyid Emirates, the Hamidian Emirates, the Fatmanid Caliphate, the Samanid Emirate in Iran. So it's very broken up at this time period. And who are some of these other Muslim powers that exist besides the Abbasids? One are the Buyid dynasty. The Buyid leader, Ali ibn Buyeh, in 945, marches on to Baghdad from the east, and he fashioned himself as the protector of the state, even though he was an independent ruler. Another that's very important is the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. They rule from 909 to 1171, and you see them appear a lot in chronicles of the Crusades. The Crusaders aren't just fighting one Muslim group. There's really two powers contesting for control in the First Crusade, the Seljuks and the Fatimids. They were Sevener Shia, and they had underground cells and vigorous proselytization missions, which is Dawah in Arabic, that particularly spread among the Berber nomads in North Africa. And I also want to mention before we wrap up Islamic law, because it's very important, but also because this is something that takes on a lot of defined features in the Abbasid period. The rise of Islamic legal thought first appears in the Umayyad period amongst a qadi, a judge, and a faqih, a jurist. A mufti is an example of a jurist, and they use different sources to come to Islamic rulings when Sharia, which is Islamic law, was being hammered out, and these judges had to make legal decisions based on the Quran. They use ilim, which is a study of knowledge and religious sciences, and the ulama were religious scholars within this body. The two major sources of Islamic law were divine revelation, as appeared in the Quran or hadiths, and human reason, aql, and dual identity of Islamic law, which is the Sharia, which is the right path, and fiqh, the product of human reason. All this to say that there's an interesting interplay between using divine revelation and human reason, and there's a tremendous amount of back and forth amongst different schools of Islamic thought and in history in how much you can use one versus the other. There have been Islamic scholars who said that, well, we should use Western sources like Aristotle and Greek philosophy subsumed into the category of human reason, combined with sources of revelation, whereas other schools of thought said you shouldn't use human reason at all and only rely on divine sources. So Sharia, Islamic law, comprises in its scope not only law but also theology and moral teaching, dogmatic theology and morality. There's not some green book out there called Sharia where all this is bound up, but it's a collection of rulings and traditions and legal precedents that have gone on for centuries. This is an imperfect analogy, but the Catholic idea of holy tradition isn't just bound up in one book, but it comes through centuries of papal edicts, councils, and other things that have filtered down. And of course, there's considerable debate amongst Catholic scholars on holy tradition, as there is on Sharia amongst Islamic scholars. Sharia does provide clear rulings, though, on fundamentals like moral values and practical duties, the 5 pillars of Islam. Few people will argue with that. There's certain tenets that just few people argue with. In other aspects of the development of Islamic law, fiqh is concerned with legal rules that relate to an individual's conduct. So it's positive a law that doesn't include general guidelines. Fiqh is also considered the knowledge of the practical rules of the Sharia, which are derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. The rules of fiqh are thus concerned with the manifest aspects of individual conduct. And the practice of conduct is evaluated on a scale of 5 values: things that are obligatory, things that are recommended, things that are permissible, things that are reprehensible, and things that are forbidden. Ijtihad is the deduction of the rule of fiqh from the Quran and Sunnah through direct contact with the sources that necessarily involves intellectual reasoning and intellectual exertion. So this means that there's a fair amount of human reasoning that goes into deducing these divine precepts. After all, the Quran as a book wouldn't touch on things like property law. Very vaguely it would, but when you're getting into the particulars of law that judges have to deal with on a frequent basis, this is where they have to use reason. Usul al-fiqh is a methodology of jurisprudence. It's a broad outline of legal theory of the sources, and there's 4 basic methods for arriving at a legal ruling or making a pronouncement. The first is using the Quran, of course. The second is ra'i, which is personal opinion. The third is qiyas, or analogy. And the fourth is ijma, or consensus. This can be consensus amongst scholars or consensus amongst previous rulings and tradition. So there's, of course, different schools of Islamic law. And I'll just jump into the 6th period. The first is the prophetic period, when law was based on the Quran and Sunnah. The second was during the period of the companions of the Prophet. This is a period of interpretation of the textual subject matter of the Sharia. And at this time, the Quran comes into the final form during the Caliphate of Uthman. And fiqh and ijtihad find their historical origins of using reason to arrive at rulings. During the 3rd period, the era of the successors, the Umayyad expansion period, and there's conflict emerging between traditionalists versus rationalists. Traditionalists saying to only rely upon revelation versus rationalists saying we can rely on human reason and even philosophical categories. The fourth is the early Abbasid period and the emergence of the major Sunni schools. This is known as the era of independent reasoning, when Greek philosophy probably has more influence than any other time. Lots of scholars are reading Aristotle. This is when classical works are being translated into Arabic. Aristotle in particular has enormous influence on Islamic jurisprudential thought. And here are some of the major different schools in Islam that you might hear about today. Hanafi is the largest and most widespread. You see it in Turkey, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. It's influenced more by rationalists. Maliki is led the traditionalist movement in the Mecca and Medina areas, and it advocated the Medinian consensus as the only valid consensus. You'll see this in North Africa primarily and the Gulf states like Bahrain and Kuwait. Shafi thought was long leading figure in the traditionalist camp, but it tried to mediate between traditionalists and rationalists. You see this in southern Egypt, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and also Southeast Asia. The last and the most conservative is Hanbali. Traditionalists who prefer not to rely on human reason, but only revealed sources. This is the smallest school, and you see it in Saudi Arabia and Wahhabi Islam. So here you see the most strict understandings of Islam, and part of the reason why Saudi Arabia has such a conservative culture. Also, Shia fiqh, there are subtle differences based on the doctrine of Nas and who's ultimately qualified to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah. Here's a broad map that shows where these different schools are. Hanafi is in purple, it's very large. Maliki, to the left in yellow, is in North Africa. In blue, you see Hanafi, but it accommodates all the four different schools. And the Hanbalis there are in red, mostly enveloping Saudi Arabia. And there you see in the blue, in the lower right side of the screen, is Shafi in Africa and Southeast Asia. But it should be noted that these schools don't completely correspond to Sunni or Shia. They do intermingle quite a bit with one another at another event that shaped the Muslim world in important ways, and that is the Crusades.